Stephen, and all the others who've joined us today, a very special welcome. Yes, indeed, it has actually been, almost a 20-year journey now. And what started off as really a personal interest into something which was rather unknown then, or relatively unknown then in the 1990s, turned into a full-time private project and then morphed itself into a funded project. And subsequently, some years later, almost a decade and a half later, resulted in academic work, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. So, Thembisa, you mentioned about other exhibitions. Perhaps we can cover that in the conclusion part. And I'm going to share now a PowerPoint presentation with you. It includes, I think, approximately 40 slides. In these slides are extremely rare photographs which were taken in the black concentration camps. In a 20-year process, I've seen a few others that are not in this presentation, but yes, they're extremely rare, and they were found in archives in various places in the world. We're also going to go on the terrain at a place called Klippiespan, which is outside Kimberley, and Dry Hearts, which is outside Vryburg, where in fact identified way back in 2001, two of the concentration camps there, in fact Dry Hearts being the worst in terms of archival records of the entire concentration camp system. So without further ado, given time, so I mean, as mentioned, the title is Recovering. And I think it's a very apt title because, in fact, if we look at what has happened in the long distant past, there is an absolute absence of memory throughout really the 20th century on this particular topic, and even now in certain respects. And I mean, the actual South African War, which we commonly notice today, I mean, those of us who are old enough will remember it being referred to as the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War. But if we take the South African War as an accepted fact, not only do we have the military conflagration which happened at the time, encompassing the state of modern South Africa, but it also included regions such as Botswana, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Mswati, Swaziland, with forces drawn from all over the world of the former British Empire. So also a regional war, but in some respects a global war. And in the better part of the 20th century, a lot of the focus was on the combatants and strategy and tactics and so on. But I think now the narrative has moved very clearly into the impact on civilians and how that in fact integrates itself not only into the regional context, but into the global context, the concept known as total war, which was perfected in the 20th century and is in application even today. So, I mean, in terms of how this was remembered, again, this is a one-of-a-kind photograph which depicts the conventional phase of the war. War Cronje, General Cronje on the left, surrendering to Lord Roberts. The standardized pictures that one sees generated and regurgitated in history books has them standing glaring at each other in a distance. Here they're in fact communicating with each other at the time of surrender. We know the combatants, again, a one-of-a-kind photograph taken immediately after the Battle of Roodepoort, which is just north of Kroonstad. Captured British soldier on the right-hand side being led into captivity by armed burghers or Boers, dead bodies under tarpaulins, the usual sort of combat photography, although very rare at the time, but how the war is broadly understood. However, when we get into total war, and in fact the war against civilians in South Africa, in particular the Boer civilians and the scorched earth policies and so on, this didn't evolve as an ad hoc British counter-strike. It was a systemic policy that evolved itself into actual total war, which had ultimately attacking the civilian population as a means of actually defeating the Boer armies in the veld. That started with the scorched earth policy. This is sort of well known, the burning and clearing of farms in the former Boer republics. It's established in South African identity, in particularly the Afrikaner community, even to this day. But however, with the clearance of land, that resulted in civilian internment, and it resulted in two completely different systems, which we're going to talk about here. The important point to remember is that while 27 or 28,000 Boer civilians perished in internment camps or concentration camps, the camps that were established for African civilians function on a completely different model. So, for example, while the Boer internees were rationed, had medical support, albeit infrequent, albeit inadequate, and received a sort of systemic support of such, they were not compelled into forced labor, which was a very different circumstance with the establishment of what was known as the Native Refugee Department, which had under its time at one point approximately 80 camps. And these were in fact, as my work has shown, and work of some others, were in fact the beginning of forced labor camps as we see in the 20th century. Incidentally, this photograph taken here of these African civilians was taken at Harrismith railway station, and approximately 4 years ago located with a local farmer 4 other additional camps. So I think that brings the total to about 18. And it actually depicts civilians here being railed from Harrismith to these particular forced labor camps in the area between Harrismith and Florian's Pass. Now, the thing with forced labor, as opposed to the Boer civilian experiences, like the Boers, civilians were forcibly removed from their homes. However, the black civilians were compelled through what was called a work or starve policy. I've actually uncovered the records of that, the actual minutes by Lord Kitchener and other senior British people, which included Cecil John Rhodes, that in fact the black internees and black civilians who'd been driven off the land were to be forced through the web mechanism of starvation to actually provide labor to the British Army, to the mines, and also agricultural labor. Again, like the Boer civilians, they were turned against their will. However, there was a slight difference. There are recorded cases of many being shot while attempting to escape from these forced labor camps. Now, again, this is a photograph. It's taken in the Kimberley area between Borshoff and Brandfort, Borshoff and Kimberley, which is approximately 60 kilometers. And here we see on the horizon the mounted infantry escorting women into internment center or concentration camp, forced labor camp at Klippiespan outside Kimberley, carrying their foodstuffs on their heads. And in fact, this woman here in the foreground has got a distinctive bangle. I won't say it's hers that we uncovered, but we found something identical to that. Again, the sort of buckets that one sees on heads here, this lady's head over here, we've actually uncovered in 2001, between 2001 and 2006, at Klippiespan, identical artifacts. This is a unique photograph. It's taken inside a black concentration camp. The gentleman over here is in fact a British Army officer. One can identify that by his rank. He's a doctor in the Royal Army Medical Corps, identified by his helmet badge. It's taken in 1901. He's wearing the black armband to mourn the death of Queen Victoria. And it's clearly a medical inspection, assisted by a black soldier on the left-hand side here, serving with the British military, in British military uniform, armed, and obviously providing a translating ability, where in fact this is the medical inspection going on here. The toddler in the center has what appears to be a ruptured umbilical, and one can see the children over here on the right literally biting their fingernails while they're having to expose themselves to this medical inspection. Of further interest is the building materials. Unlike the Boer camps, there are no tents provided, so we see the use of local building materials, thatch, improvisation on the harsh felt. Again, it's the same scene, same person, just a different angle. But from the archaeological perspective, again, the sort of corrugated iron, sadly, we see the situation still in this country today, corrugated iron shelters, boots drying out in the huts, traditional pottery there, and tins and so on. It's not known where this is. It could possibly be in the Kimberley area. Also of interest is the hard compacted ground that they're standing on, all of which assists in archaeological surveys. So this particular project, which started in 2001 and concluded itself in 2012, was called Recovering the Trace, a transdisciplinary approach using both tangible and intangible heritage assets. The tangible was an archival audit in South Africa and the United Kingdom, which also involved terrain and archaeological examinations, uncovering approximately, in the Kimberley case alone, about 3,000 individual artifacts. The intangible was living heritage, oral history, and memory. And while some people may think that 120 years later there's none of that around anymore, we actually tapped into a very rich record of oral history, which I'll share with you. This was Brandfort in 1999 with Elias Nkane, who was at that time estimated to be 106, 107 perhaps, who was a child in the Brandfort Black concentration camp. And as it often happens with very elderly people, could not remember yesterday, but could actually cast a mind quite far back. with an incredible attention to detail. In fact, this was the first site that I located in 1999 from where the Anglo-Boer War, South African War commemorations were launched. And this is in fact where the journey started really in terms of this particular topic. Now this is what is generally accepted to be the number of black concentration camps that existed, 65. This list is completely inaccurate. There's probably up to 100 at various stages. So again, one has to be very careful when actually dealing with what seems to be accepted fact based around purely an archival record. The archaeological record in some cases is far more important. And as I'll share with you shortly, in the case of the Klippiespan camp outside Kimberley, there is no archival record. However, the archaeological record was there. So there were many camps for which records were not kept, or in fact, immediately after the war were destroyed as being of no further value. So archaeology is, of course, extremely important in locating these sites. Now, this is the Klippiespan camp in Kimberley. Kimberley, sort of the edge of Kimberley, eastern edge of Kimberley city here. The main city being to the left of and off this photograph. Approximately 7 to 8 kilometers outside of town is the Klippiespan camp, which was set up in 1901. It has a very short history, probably a few months before the internees in that camp and another camp here, Blankenberg's Vlei, which has subsequently disappeared under mining activity, were relocated to Dry Hearts, which we will also discuss. It gives you a scale of size. There were 2 halves to the camp, and the rubbish dump sites, which we found. I'll give you an example. So these camps, they had as their primary purpose with forced labor was the women and children were to actually grow vegetables and provide that to the British forces. So what one will often find is evidence of ploughed lands. And in this particular case, the old roads and tracks that led into the camp and the discolorations here that one sort of sees from a distance on the ground, which when going in closer, for example, these 2 particular living areas here, one picks up the human impact. That's the exact site today. So if one goes back there, this particular area, one can see the sort of red earth that's been compacted. And now, of course, that's the identical area, obviously plotted from GPS. These are photographs that were taken inside the Kimberley camps. There are 2 or 3 that are and they are the only visual record which exist. Of interest again, as one sees very few men, if any. There's only 1 here in the center, mainly women and children. The men, of course, having been compelled to labor for the military forces in order to ration their families. Again, from an archaeological, historical perspective, the corrugated iron, the impact on ground as well, so this may be of interest to the archaeologists, is that when going out into the veld, we all know that grass does not grow in right angles, such as this. So this photograph was taken in 2006. So we're talking 105 years after the event, where in fact this particular shelter or dwelling has left its imprint on the landscape, and one sees the surrounding veld growing away naturally as it would. This is the exact site where we were excavating it. And what we found just in this one particular living area, apart from personal cultural material, is grinding stones, upper and lower grinding stones. The internees were rationed with horse meal and millie cobs, and therefore the grinding stones were used. And they were brought in from the Borshof area and the farms in the surrounding area when they were cleared out by the military in the forcible removal process. And the intriguing question is, why were they left when in fact the civilians here were then moved to Dry Hearts? Because they had wheel transport when they came into the camp. Their wheel transport was then confiscated for military use, and therefore they had no way of carrying that. So in this particular area, we found several hundred grinding stones. Each one would have marked the exact cooking food preparation areas. This here is actually a fireplace which we uncovered. So some closer other personal detail, the gold pendant, neck pendant, women's jewelry. In fact, the majority of artifacts found at Klippiespan spoke to women. The only artifacts which spoke to men were in fact British military equipment and personal effects. So again, excavating living and food preparation areas, as I mentioned, we uncovered up to approximately 3,000 artifacts. Here, a silver brazier or bra buckle made in Paris. On the right, silver thimble, sewing thimble, condensed milk ration tins. We know they were issued with condensed milk, or particularly infants and children were watered down with water. And again, part of a teardrop earring over there. In terms of the fireplaces, we were able to find fireplaces. That's actually a sort of a barrel hoop, where in fact the fire was then built inside it. Excavated there inside that, for finding ash, bone, various other effects, and even sort of buttons and other items that would have been thrown into the coals. A sort of interesting mix here: glass bottles, bone fragments, ceramics in some cases. So, for example, here again, it shows evidence of British Army rationing, the top of a standard British Army ration tin, meat tin, with bone fragments with the upper grinding stone there. And the bone fragments are fragments because they've literally been pounded to get the marrow out. As mentioned, the mail trace, regimental button, identified the regiment. Yes, they were in the area at that time. Bridles, horseshoes and so on. Ammunition. So, one was able to connect the two. So as mentioned, there's no archival record of this camp. We was able to piece it together through the archaeology. So, for example, this photograph here with this particular bucket, it's not the exact place, but it's indicative of the product of the time. Identical item found there. This was in fact taken in Klerksdorp Black Concentration Camp or forced labor camp. Again, in Klerksdorp, rations being issued here. Of course, we see sort of upper and lower grinding stones, as we found at Klippiespan Black Labor Camp. And as I mentioned, we found none of these at Dry Hearts because they've been left behind at Klippiespan. So to form this camp, this came from, the information here came from various British sources, some of which actually included the De Beers Consolidated Mine Archives, which had an extensive record of the one camp in Kimberley on their property. So one was able to reconstruct from that and other sources. So there were 4 black concentration camps at Kimberley, Orange River Station, 3, and Taung, which then totaled up to approximately 3,500 refugees or internees who were then moved up in September by rail, initially to Taung in late September 1901. This photograph is the only one of its kind that I've ever seen. It's taken directly outside the main entrance to the Kimberley railway station. And I mean, the building is still there, one can match it up. And it actually depicts a family about to be deported from Kimberley to Dry Hearts concentration camp. It's dated September 1901, which is exactly when it happened. What we see inside this railway coach is personal property, sure, but we see evidence here of lots of grain bags. And those grain bags would have been taken, well, when they were issued with grain or mealies or whatever, in Klippiespan, they saved the bags and they were using these to build shelters. They set no tents. One can see the haggard expression on these civilians' faces, given what they've endured and what they're about to endure. As mentioned, the initial disembarkation was at Taung, which is about a day's walking distance from Dry Hearts. And again, at the Taung near Itreleng village in 2008, myself and a colleague located the burial site, which is approximately an acre and approximately 2,000 to 3,000 graves in there, which is important to note because the British records for the existence of the Taung camp, the official archival records, have about 85 deceased. So again, the written archive, the colonial narrative, is to be treated with great caution. That's just a photograph of the graveyard or burial site, forgotten burial site next to Itreleng. We did speak to the elders there. They did say to us that there's no actual connection between themselves and this far predates them. And there was one archival document which I found that related to the exact positioning of where this camp was to be located, and it's exactly where this burial site was found. Now, this was taken at Dry Hearts. It was taken on the 16th of June, ironic date, 2001. And John Bartman there, he lived in Dry Hearts, in fact, not too far from where we are standing. He was the son of Andries Bartman, and Andries Bartman was one of the survivors of the Dry Hearts concentration camp. So he was able firsthand, having been born on this farm and lived on this farm all his life, to tell us what happened as related to him. We're actually standing in the cemetery site at Dry Hearts, which is completely overgrown then, and I suspect very much the case now. So to give an idea of the terrain itself, what's interesting with human activity and human impact is that, in fact, we battled initially, and I say we, it was a colleague of mine, Liz Fucht, who's subsequently deceased. We struggled to find any evidence on the ground of where the camp may have been other than the cemetery, and eventually arrived at the conclusion that, in fact, the modern day village overlays the actual historic footprint of the camp. which makes sense because the ground, when the locals here started to settle here due to forced removals in the 1940s, 1950s, and particularly the 1970s and 80s, moved into an area which was unoccupied, but yet had all the necessary infrastructure, wells, etc., to start working from. That is the original bottom photograph, is the original train station at Dry Hearts where disembarkation would have occurred. And in terms of the archival records locating the sites, the one thing with archival records in the British military is that when you find evidence of archival records that relate directly to a camp, there's always some financial issue. It's a compensation claim to a landowner, it's rent for the use of their farm. It's usually, these things always happen, it boils down to money. And that way there's a very thin trace in the archival record, but I was able to locate the site because it referred to Mrs. Scumby's farm, which in the deeds office tells one exactly where that was. And so hence we actually found the site eventually. It took some walking around the veld and getting hopelessly lost at certain cases, but John Bartman eventually was able to assist us. That is the house that he lived in. That house was there at the time. It was used by the camp administrators, hence the kraals as well. And Mrs. Scumby's house was in this general area here behind those trees. So just on a side, that there's actually a current project with the War Museum in Bloemfontein, which is starting this month actually, and it's to build the first ever scale model of Dry Hearts Camp. I think it's a 1:8 scale model, so it's going to be extremely large, using my information, but also I'm meeting the architectural model builder there just after Easter, and he's going to photograph all the buildings and so get the facts right as best as they can. This was one of the camp commanders, extremely cavalier in his reports. In fact, for 4 or 5 months, he never even wrote a single report about the camp, nor alone kept death statistics, and bragged about these prayers and saying that, that actually sunk wells and put land under cultivation, which for us, looking for this camp was useful because we actually found the original wells, which narrowed down exactly where the living areas would have been. What's interesting is that refugees were being driven off their farms and arriving at Dry Hearts actually before the formation of this camp by some time. It's the only written record that has been uncovered of someone actually commenting on what's going in there by Reverend E.W.H.R. Brown. He was from the Moffat Mission in Kuruman, and he actually comments there and describes in graphic detail what was going on. And in fact, it was this comment which I read in the 1990s, and I remember thinking to myself, I really should actually try and find this place. Also, Captain Lockwaters of the compensation claim, I mean, he talks about the cemetery ground being about 1,000 square meters, and the average size of a human grave is 2 square meters, so it corresponds to a death rate of about 2,000 people, which I'll comment on shortly. That's an aerial photograph of the site, the burial site. And what's interesting with this site is these are the original pathways that ran through it. And in this particular area here is very distinctively, one sees from the graves and how they're laid out, a very different pattern. It's very haphazard. In other words, no military control as such in the laying out of graves. And I suspect that is the people that Brown was commenting on before the establishment of the camp. What we then had is in this particular area here, 1901 tombstones, and in this particular area here, 1902. And there was some evidence of maybe some burials here, so it's just easier to make a rectangle like that, but that is the organic effective shape of what it was. This is a ground scene again with a survey here, flagging in grave mounds and so on. The British, inverted commas, official records suggest no more than 500 deaths. In 3/4 of this cemetery, Elizabeth Fuchs and I counted 1,700 graves over a 2-week period, surveying them all in. 4,000 square meters, and what we counted there, the conservative estimate is at least 2,000 people perishing of starvation in this particular place. So again, the point being is the colonial written record, which many historians, particularly when dealing with this topic, place great emphasis on. At the end of the day, it's actually the evidence on the ground that's going to tell us what or what may not have happened. In terms of gravestones, again, different ethnic groups, those coming in from, or being brought in from the Kimberley, Free State, Boshoff area, those being brought in from the Western Transvaal, different language groups, and so on. So, for example, there was approximately 40 or 50 engraved tombstones out of 2,000 graves. Well, these are the ones that we were able to identify. Sarah Baletse, born 1890, died 1901. Sami Dami, in this particular example, born 1881, dying in 1901, so an adult. Again, different types of engravings made with a nail. So more on the right-hand side, Dorcas Botsane, a different type of engraving. The dating of graves or the non-dating of graves. Again, what we did, this was certainly not digging into human remains, anything like that, but we had permission from Sarah to open up sort of topsoil that had compacted around these graves, because what we found with many of the gravestones that were protruding from the ground, they've been broken by cattle activity afterwards. And in doing so, we were able to reconstruct. So, for example, this particular grave, there's no personal details in the bottom, but we were able to reconstruct or recover here. Lisi Mareme, 1902, aged 3 years old. What was also of interest is that on a number of the children's graves, we found Stone Age tools. And look, I'm no Stone Age expert, but these were hand axes. And in surveying the entire area around Dryharts, kilometers around when we were working there, we found absolutely no evidence of stone tools. However, on Klippie's Pond near Kimberley, on the actual site itself, there's plenty of Stone Age tools. So the theory was that, in fact, the hypothesis is that the children had picked these stone tools up in Kimberley, taken them with them to Dryharts. They had perished there, and there were talismans that were actually then put onto their graves. In terms of the memories of Dryharts forced labor camp, this is on the left-hand picture here is Barnaby Phillips, who's a lead journalist with the BBC and now Al Jazeera. I brought him out there in 2001, and he did a number of interviews which were on the BBC about the identification of this camp. And in this particular instance, he's interviewing Klein Jan Marupeng. That's how Mr. Marupeng spelled his surname. I know there are variations on it. And Mr. Marupeng was in his late 80s then, in 2001. And his father had actually served in the South African War with the Boer forces, and he was quite proud of that. So he asked him, why do they call you Klein Jan? And he said, well, my father was Groot Jan. I said, okay, so what's the distinguishing factor? He said, well, his father was in the war, hence he's Groot. He wasn't. He was born afterwards, so hence he's Klein. And we also were able, through this process, to have a number of discussions with very elderly African men and women in the village who actually had a connection to parents who'd not only been in the concentration camps, but also had actually served with the Boer and British forces in certain cases. But what was interesting with this is that the two stones on the top of the picture are in Boshoff town in the Free State, which was cleared out of civilians to Kimberley, Klippie's Pond, and then to Dryharts. And I've just used these two photographs, or there's another two to show. Is at the top left one here, just outside Boshoff Township. The carving on that with a Christian cross is absolutely virtually identical to a stone in the Dryharts cemetery. And again here, the Sani Dami stone, if one looks at the angulations of the carving, which might have deteriorated slightly over time, there's the Dami surname in Boshoff, and again the sort of angulated carvings on the grave. Again with Lesi Mareme, there's Mareme in Boshoff Township, or buried in that cemetery, born after the war. But again, this distinctive engraving pattern on the tombstones, the top one being at Dryharts, the bottom one being in Boshoff, and this one on the left one sees that distinctive geometrics. And it comes through many graves in the Boshoff Township. So we were able to, it's a speculation, sure, but we're able to suggest that, well, these people in this particular part of the cemetery at Dryharts originated from Boshoff or the surrounding districts. Those in other parts of the cemetery originated from other districts and so on. And look, I think with that, I hope I haven't raced through this too quickly, but let's open it up to questions.
Well, thank you, Garth, for that presentation. And my guess is that especially the students for whom this seminar is really organized will have lots of questions. But if I can just kick it off, I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen or if you want to write down the questions that come up. Let me also just say that the participants are welcome to use the chat to put questions as well, and I'll try to monitor those as best I can. But you could use the reactions feature to raise your hand as well. Garth, this is such an important topic and also a difficult one that brings up a lot of emotion because it's a history of injustice. And I guess let me just start by asking you, what made you interested in this topic and how did you get involved in that?
Oh, that's quite a long story. I got interested in the South African War probably at about the age of 6, and that really was because I had recovered some papers that were about to be thrown on the bonfire and being disposed of at home, and retrieved them and got curious. So I think to be fair there, it's curiosity. By the time I was 10, I'd sort of pillaged my parents' friends' libraries and all the rest of it and started reading. But all that stuff then in the very early 70s was a very conventional thing. But nevertheless, it became a personal interest. In terms of the black concentration camp system, I was, at the time in 1998, 1999, I was working in the Kimberley area, developing the exhibit for the Marsfontein Battlefield Museum outside Kimberley, and was then approached by a consultant to the Department of Arts and Culture to actually do some research in the Brunford area where they were going to start off the commemorations for the South African War. And in that process, identified Eliza Nkane, who I referred to earlier, and spoke with her. And what she shared with me, it was I won't say it was a life-changing moment. It was epiphanal, certainly in a certain sense, where one's own sense of social justice, human justice, and a sense of astute history says, well, hang on a moment, there's a whole other narrative here, and let's go and find that narrative as best as we can, and uncover it and recover it. And essentially, in brief, that's what happened.
I'm looking for hands, I'm looking for questions. Gerald.
Thank you, Garth, for that. It was very interesting. Several times you referred to that you were able subsequently to find some archival documents. And just as a matter of curiosity, I would like to know where you find them, because it sounds to me, I'm familiar with the work of Elizabeth van Heinigen and the amazing sources that she was able to use. But from what you say, I gather you don't have something similar for the black camps, and it's really kind of one document here and one document there. So if you could say a bit more about where did you find the bit of archival evidence that you could find, and perhaps also a bit why was the administration so incredibly bad and haphazard compared to the very detailed records that exist for the white camps? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Gerald. Yes, the thing is with the Boer camps, there was very accurate, or let's say consistent record keeping kept, and certainly not with the black force and concentration camps. And I think one of the reasons why is that actually at the end of the day boils down to value of life. And the colonial or the British approach then was that it was they worked the camps on a basis which came out of India for the plague camps and also Hong Kong, where in their empire really the only time that they would actually intervene in a humanitarian crisis was if in fact that crisis would actually threaten or affect the white colonial population. So it was the camps were run on very much a let-die basis. If in fact people were not prepared to cooperate, well, they were left to starve to death. It was simple as that. And therefore, based on a totally different value of life principle or lack of principle, records weren't kept. I mean, there would not have been births registered or deaths registered by name. I mean, there are these statistical records that do exist for some of the camps, but they're just numbers. And as my research has shown, is that the archaeological record contradicts those numbers by a great deal. Also, is the surviving records are those that as a sort of referred to mainly deal with matters of financial matters, compensation, the sad reality, you know, that you keep a record about a financial transaction, but not necessarily about the impact on human beings. So there's that, but also at the time, in the case of dry hearts particularly, there's 4 or 5 months where there's actually no statistical information, there's absolutely nothing. And there's no evidence to suggest that was ever queried. You know, many of these camps were located in isolated areas, and what often finds with in the military system is the further removed from the chain of command, the greater the atrocities occur. So there's that too. But the other thing as well is that when the war ended, bear in mind with forced labor, the person who's a forced laborer is really just a means to an end. And when that end is ended, whether they're dead or whether the war comes to a conclusion, it's of no further value. And there is evidence that, in fact, immediately after the war, many of these records were destroyed, not to cover up what had happened, but there was of no further use. Whereupon, with the reconstruction of post-war South African society at that time, the sort of reconciliation between the Boers and the British, who were former opponents, records were kept because they were necessary for the reconstruction of a society dominated by those groups. Whereupon, for the majority experience in terms of these black camps, it was over. The war was done, and that was that, an end of that. So there was destruction of records on the one hand immediately thereafter, but there's also evidence that shows that certain records that did survive, you know, into the apartheid era, as archival practice goes, you know, files are weeded to as an archival practice, you can't keep everything. So an archivist will make an opinion and say, right, fine, this is no longer relevant 60 years later. Mass destruction, well, not mass destruction, but it's large-scale destruction of what was left of the fragmentary written archive on the black camps, right up into the 1980s. So a combination of factors, records not being kept, certainly detailed records on individuals not being kept whatsoever. There is one, for example, I'll just share one anecdote in the camp north of Kroonstad called Hollenspreid, which is between Koppies and Kroonstad. The woman there actually went on strike. They refused to keep harvesting these fields because they were starving to death. And the record that came back saying hence it was kept was that, in fact, no, that's fine. Then let them starve to death, cut their rations off, and they'll soon start working a week later. But the only reason that record was kept was there was some reference to rent that was going to be paid to the farmer. Claim. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. But systematic destruction, casual destruction, and a lack of keeping in the original case, all based around value of life, or the lack thereof.
Thanks for that, Garth. We've got a question from our new PhD student, Karen Jennings. If you would like to unmute yourself, Karen.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, there doesn't seem to be a raise hand thing in my reactions section. I'm not sure why. Well, I just wanted to ask you, I'm very interested in what you were saying about the oral history, and I'm interested to what extent that oral history still exists, because just on a personal note, my mother's father was born in 1904, and he was Afrikaans and my mom's Afrikaans, and when she married an Englishman in 1978, it was a massive scandal in the family all those years later after the war that she was, you know, marrying an Englishman. It was a betrayal and all sorts of things. So I'm just wondering if that kind of feeling or sense of bitterness and betrayal, if that still continued on for decades later, or if it was perhaps wiped out or pushed to the side by other things happening in South Africa that perhaps were more pressing concerns.
Okay, thanks, Karen. There's two parts to your question. The first part, in terms of oral history, yes, I can give you plenty of examples, but I'll give you one. And that is at Dry Hearts, the elderly people that we spoke to, and by that I mean people in their 70s, 80s, and so on, who had a direct family connection to this. They were all absolutely consistent when I asked them, so I find what happened here, you know? And their first thing was, well, firstly, these people are unconnected to us because we only moved here in the 40s or the 50s or so on. But what they heard from Mr. Bartman Sr., who had actually been there, or from their parents as well, is it was a consistent narrative that the people who died at Dry Hearts died of poisoned pup. Okay, now we know that the British weren't putting poison into the mealie pup. I mean, why kill your forced labourers? But this was consistent. It ran all the way through. And what eventually I established there was that, in fact, again, was going into the compensation claims that the landowner put into the British military, where the British military said, look, we're not going to pay you for firewood that your claim was used because there was no wood on your farm. Now, so how do you cook your mealie meal if there's no wood on the farm? Okay. The second thing there is that they spoke about the fact that their parents or their grandparents were being given what was called geel pup, which is like a very low grade mealie meal, which if you live off, you'll basically starve to death. And it was being crushed down at a mill up at the railway station or somewhere by the British, and then being fed to them. There's literally a product called Sowen stew, which was invented in the siege of Mafeking, where the husks are dried up. Again, you'd starve to death being fed on it. But the water sources were being contaminated, which is a standard thing not only in the Boer camps, but also in the black forced labor camps and concentration camps, by typhoid fever. So if you've got water that's infected by typhoid fever, or enteric fever, or even salmonella in your pup, okay, and you haven't got firewood to actually boil it, the outcome is going to be quite inevitable. And a number of these people told us that in fact, entire families died within days, you know, after arriving and being issued with rations. So there is a direct way of seeing that. And just one other brief example in Brunfort with Eliza Nkane, I asked her, I said, who owned the land that the farm was on? She said, Johnny May. And I thought, that's bizarre. This is the Free State in the late 1900s. But the landowner was in fact Lucas Murray, with a hyphen on the name. Lucas Murray owned the land. When the British Army arrived, he immediately rented it out and made an income off it. When the war ended, I mean, he was ostracized by his community for being a collaborator. And people who were collaborators after the war were known as joiners. So 100 years later, the memory of Eliza Nkane, Johnny Murray was Johnny May. So, you know, one has to look far beyond the immediate obvious of what's being said. So yes, I do believe there's still a rich oral history narrative that is actually waiting there to be uncovered from the concentration camps and from other historical experiences, either in the late 19th century or even the early 20th century. It's just a question of actually identifying it and interpreting it. The second half to your question is about the sort of bitterness that lasted. That's, you know, again, we must remember that people who, and I'm talking purely about the Boer experience there, people who experience that kind of enforced horror on themselves have many ways of reacting to it. And it's a case of Sarah Fun that's also then set in the context of the apartheid or the emergence of Afrikaner nationalism, which played a very key role in recovering in a strange sense this sort of narrative, and without a doubt twisting it to suit its own nationalistic agendas. So yeah, we could talk a very long time about this, but I hope that answers your question, and if not, please ask again.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. It's very fascinating. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Garth. We've got a couple questions from students in the chat. Prudence Africa is saying that this seems like a very emotional, well, it is a very emotional topic, and she would like to know how you process that emotion. Let me also ask Bukutlo's question. She said that as you were showing the gravestones, some of them are named and some of them are not. And so during the finding process, when you were uncovering these, were you able to find out why some of them had names on them and some did not?
Okay. I'll answer the second question first. The naming, again, look, we can hypothesize, again, there's no record as such, but if one looks at the cultural practice in the Boshoff case with the engravings and the name similarities, you know, there was obviously a practice then of doing that. And I think one of the factors there with actually naming and dating gravestones, it's a reflection of people who have actually come from farms, or it was then small Boer towns, like Boshoff, Jacobsdal, Ranfort, and so on, and had it taken on that European practice of doing it. They had the exposure to it, and they'd taken that on. And also it may reflect too the impact of missionaries as well in the areas where those practices then came about. So there's that cross-cultural interaction, and I think it's a reflection of that. Those that weren't named were either maybe not literate or didn't have that practice, or maybe were dying in such numbers, and in fact the entire families were wiped out, that there was no one left to record their particulars. So there's that. Your first question in terms of the emotional angle to this topic, yes, it is, but you know, it is something when you stand in the veld with 2,000 graves around you. There's no doubt about that. However, one has to remember that we're dealing with the recovery of the memory of human beings, and I think that is the focal point. So I've always found, and I've found thousands of these grave sites, is that it's actually, while it may be historically sad and traumatic, and there's even, let's say on another angle, the restless ancestral angle to it too, is that it's an identification of human beings and actually who they were, even if they may remain nameless, at least they're not forgotten.
I'm looking for more questions from students, but meanwhile, Stephen Sparks has a question.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Thank you, Garth. So, I mean, I suppose the first thing was that, you know, you talk about the limits of written sources, certain written sources, and then, but of course, they also bring other written sources in that help to create a sort of better picture of what happened. So I suppose if there's a question, it's a question I think that would be useful for all of us, which is, you've sort of provided some hints of this, but maybe if you can just kind of revisit it, is how do you tell how to evaluate, how can you tell how to evaluate the reliability of sources? Which sources do you trust over others? If they're providing an account of, say, one particular site where there was a concentration camp, which sources do you trust? Is it a triangulation process? So I think it'd be nice for people to hear more about that as a process, because it's something that historians do all the time, but it's not something that's obvious beforehand. You know, we don't know how to do this beforehand. And then the second one is actually something that's quite unremarked in your presentation anyway, which is about the visual. So you use these visual sources, the photographs, very nicely, and some of them are incredible. And I'd love to have, for instance, when I teach the South African War at first year, or when I used to do that, I always searched for nice pictures that were sort of beyond the ordinary ones that we're used to. And there are some nice ones, but the ones you have are also really excellent. But you don't actually reflect, or you didn't reflect in any way in your introductory remarks on visual sources themselves, and the challenges and of course the opportunities that they present.
Well, they do present, one's got to say to yourself, which lens are we looking through? For example, with visual sources. And many of them, when I look at I've looked at photographs, and we'll talk clearly to the black concentration camp thing here, and perhaps even the Boer camps too, to a certain matter, is that what is the photographer actually wishing to capture? And what is their motivation behind that? And I suspect in some cases it was that sort of that mindset of anthropology, where one's going out into this particular area, and there's that whole idea of the curiosity of the other and actually photographing that. The case of the medical inspections, I think that was more a case of, let's just keep a record that we actually were doing this. That in fact, if we ever accused that we weren't in this particular area providing medical support, so a completely different motivation there. And in the case of the Kimberley camp with those shelters and buildings or dwellings as such, again, the photographer there, he's identified. He was a soldier with the Kimberley Regiment, and again, I think that's really a case of curiosity, documenting what you're personally witnessing too. For example, some people, when one finds these photographs, had a rather large photographic collection, in which case it might be one photograph of civilians, and the rest is all of soldiers. So there is that. The reflection on that is that, you know, what records do you actually accept, what don't you accept, and what do you partially accept or not at all? And what I found, again, speaking strictly to this narrative, other projects it can be very different, is that the archaeology has been extremely important, because that is the actual forensic evidence as such that is on the terrain where one is looking. And as mentioned here, with the British record keeping in these particular examples, dry huts is nothing. Sorry, Klippiespan is absolutely nothing. There's only one reference to a camp actually existing there, which was actually in the local newspaper, and it gave an approximate distance. So there's absolutely nothing there whatsoever in terms of their sources. So that in itself is a reflection. You ask yourself the question, why? And the only plausible explanation is the fact they were destroyed. Whereupon the archaeological record, in the case of Dry Hearts and many other places that I've visited and surveyed and worked on, the written record stops at a certain point, and that is the value of archaeology where it comes in. So, as I mentioned before, is that if one only relies, and I mean, if one looks at work by other people, past and perhaps present too, where it's purely based on the documentary archive and dealing particularly with this particular topic, that's going to have a gap in it, because the archaeology at the end of the day is the evidence on the ground. That's actually where it happened and what happened. And okay, granted, that's subject to a lot of reflection and interpretation too. But when you've got graves in a certain place, you've got wells in a certain place, that goes beyond a mere discussion about 450 people died, we sunk wells and improved a lot of everybody. That actually goes into a whole different narrative. I hope that answers your question, Stephen.
Thank you, Garth. I think we've got time for one more question, but I think there's two in the chat that sort of go together. I'm sorry I don't know your name, Mkize, who thanks you for the research and wonders, while you were doing this research, which requires excavation, how did people in the area react to seeing you working on grave sites? And what steps did you take in order to be able to get access to land like that? And Karen had a follow-up question that's sort of similar. Did you ever, or related, did you ever encounter a resistance or people unwilling to speak to you about this in the course of your research?
Okay, well, yeah, there are two questions which I'll speak to the same answer. The answer is actually no. The only unwillingness that was encountered was by Afrikaans-speaking farmers in the Free State area. The Kimberley area, no, the landowner was actually completely supportive. And in the case of Dry Hearts, the local community there, when I first went into that area, met with the Kahosi, met with the elders, explained what it is we were wanting to do, ran them through the whole thing. And he was actually very encouraging about it. And when it came to the actual site work, I mean, the labor that we used, we hired locally from the recommendation of the Kahosi and his elders. And there was, in fact, keen interest in it versus skepticism. And of course, we've made it very clear from the beginning that we're not excavating human remains. We're going nowhere near that. We're merely actually identifying, counting graves, locating them into a mapping system, and in the case of headstones, actually identifying people who would have otherwise remained identified. So they were very supportive and very interested, and this is actually how the access to the oral history came about, because while we were working there, we had many people come and say, right, fine, I've actually got something to share with you. So it was a very natural organic process. It wasn't a rigid sort of appointments. I mean, one would say, do you mind if I make notes? Yeah, sure, that sort of thing. But through the work itself on site, that's actually how much access to the oral history occurred. So no resistance there. The only sort of hostility, as I said, I've experienced was by Afrikaans-speaking farm owners in the Harry Smith or other areas who did not want this narrative to ever be identified to the land that they were farming on. And that puts itself into contemporary politics.
Well, I know we're out of time, but there's just a couple other questions. So for those who would like to stay, for those who would like to stay, BNJ Khadebe asks, during your research, did you encounter difficulties, and if so, what were they? And I'm going to afterwards ask Lungelo Nzimande to ask his question about memory. So maybe in that order, you can first of all answer about the difficulties, and then we'll call on Lungelo.
Okay. The difficulties, and I don't say this tongue in cheek, the real difficulties that were encountered were snakes, scorpions, extremely hot weather, lightning when caught out in the veld. In some cases, tires bursting in the middle of nowhere, being towed by donkey carts or whatever it might be, which in turn was humorous. But the actual practicality of working in the field, it's always great fun despite the difficulties. In reality, those were the difficulties. I mean, what we would do in the case of Klippiespan is cover up with plastic, the excavated area when we finished that day, so that things wouldn't get in there. And in one particular case, the following morning, we came out, we pulled the cover off, and out came an 8-foot-long Cape Cobra. And I realized that at that very moment, I was going to either lose my team or keep my team, and got in behind the cobra, grabbed it by the tail, lifted it off the ground, and thought, what the hell do I do with this now? I mean, I'm holding a snake up that's actually almost longer than myself, and that's to fling it away. My team stayed with me for the rest of the year. That was a make or break moment on that particular project. So yes, in terms of difficulties, there was that. The second question, Thembisa, was around memory, I think.
Yeah, Lungelo, do you want to ask your question?
Hey, thank you very much for this presentation and the research. I'm not very familiar with the South African War. I'm not very familiar with the details, apart from what I did in high school and maybe in first year. But whenever I thought about the South African War, it was always about how the Afrikaners were essentially taken into these concentration camps. I had an idea that there were Black people involved in the South African War, and that they may have been captured, but I didn't know to this extent that there were actual concentration camps, internment camps that were made specifically for them. So this was very enlightening. So thank you for that. And my question is, like I said, it has to do with memory, and I'm pretty sure that memory plays a very important role in something like this, because the individuals who were actually involved, I'm sure they're of a pretty advanced age. Whatever they went through, they probably passed it on to their children, grandchildren, and whatnot. So how do you then work with, in terms of methodology, how do you then work with perhaps gaps in memory, gaps in research, and tying that all in with what's happening in the environment itself? And I'd also like to know if the area where you were working, excavating the various areas, if there's some sort of collective memory that sort of ties the people of the area to the area itself and this particular history. And that's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thanks. The thing there with the collective memory, that's a very important point, because in the case of Dry Hearts, as I mentioned, there's the community there. There was, in fact, a collective memory around the cause of death, poison, pup, that sort of thing, and also a very clear memory that, in fact, they living there, with the one or two exceptions, were not descended from those who were actually in the burial site. So that we were able to start to find, so how did this come about? And it came about through forced removals in the 40s and 50s, in particular the establishment of former Botswana, where people were moved in from other areas of the Northwest province and so on. And that then in itself opened up an entire interesting other angle. But yes, very much collective memory in the case of Dry Hearts. In the case of Klippiespan, nothing. And in the case of Brandfort, one person 100 years after the event. But I think the thing when it comes to the South African War and memory of that, there will be, yes. But we must remember that very, very shortly after the South African War, I mean, those who have been returned after the camps were closed back to farms or wherever they'd originated from, it was only going to be 10 or 11 years later that they were going to experience the Land Act, on Union of South Africa and the Land Act, and massive dispossession again. So whatever material wealth that they may or may not have kept post-war was wiped out. And in the emergence of the sort of segregationist apartheid state later, there were far greater traumas or successive traumas that came either on those who experienced the camps or those who followed in the next generation. And that may go some way to explaining the gap in memory that does exist around this topic. However, there is memory, but it's certainly not. I mean, if you ask most Afrikaans descendants, they'll be able to tell you, yes, no, either yes or no, my family were involved here, they were in this camp or that camp or not. But so it's the experience of the 20th century, really, that I think has actually had a lot of impact. But the thing to also remember is the interconnectedness of this whole thing. Is that this is 1900, 1901, 1902. In 1906, merely 4 years later, you have the genocide by the German Southwest African administration on the Herero and Nama people. And a lot of the perpetrators of that were watching what was happening in South Africa. And the perpetrators of that, many of them were senior Nazis or the parents of senior Nazis later. So there is a link, but it interconnects differently. So how does one actually remember something? There's many different ways of doing it. And of course, there will always be gaps. I hope that addresses your question, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, that addresses my question. Thank you.
Only a pleasure.
Well, I think we're going to end on that note. Thanks for sharing your research with us, Garth. It's it's eye-opening, and it's eye-opening in a number of ways. But I think it's clearly important work, and I know you've had a number of exhibitions in various public sites, museums, and so on. Maybe you could just finish by telling us just a tiny bit about that, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. It's been an interesting clientele, let's put it that way. The first museum exhibition I put together was, as I mentioned, in 98-99, the Marsfontein Battlefield Museum just outside Kimberley. And that focused very much, obviously, on what had happened at that site, being a battle site as such. Other projects that I worked on was the Chief Albert Luthuli Museum in KwaDukuza. I developed and installed the permanent exhibition there in 2004 in Chief Albert Luthuli's former residence. Voortrekker Monument, interestingly enough, 20 years ago, an exhibition for them, which was aimed at sort of moving their narrative beyond the Groot Trek as such. And a particularly special one which I've worked on right from the beginning was in fact Lilies Leaf in Rivonia, starting way back in 2004. And on that particular project, I worked very closely with the Lilies Leaf Trust, who appointed me. And again, there I had to do the archival audit, which was America, Britain, Europe, and South Africa. Plus, work on the archaeology of actually restoring and uncovering the actual buildings that were at Lilies Leaf and restoring them to what you see today, working with an architectural team. And then an oral history project, which involved interviewing and having discussions with everyone from Nelson Mandela right down to some of the very, very low operatives in Gonto Sizwe and the South African Communist Party and ANC. So that in itself was also a bit of a triangulation project. A lot of fun, a lot of hard work. But then that's the nature of the thing. And I always believe if you don't enjoy what you're doing, then you shouldn't be doing it. And there's been others, battle sites in the KZN, Nelson Mandela National Museum, I was on their council between 2003, 2006. And more recently with the War Museum in Bloemfontein, which deals with the South African War, there's narratives that are being developed there. So across spectrum, as I said, a huge amount of fun, and I'm very happy to share the results of that again at some other platform. Thank you, Thembisa.
Thank you, Garth, and thank you for everybody for joining us today. We look forward to hopefully seeing many of you again next month, and we'll talk soon. So bye, everybody.
All right, thank you, everybody.